So thank you everyone for joining us today. This is a really timely topic, although quite frankly, it's something that we speak with our clients about often in terms of being in that position as an advocate for a loved one, whether they're hospitalized or in a nursing home. But as you all know, in today's climate in particular, advocating has become a little bit more difficult, particularly where we cannot go in and actually see our loved ones and speak with their healthcare providers in person. So I'm going to switch over now and I'm going to start the presentation. I'm going to ask everyone to just hold on for a moment while I do that so that you all can share my screen. So wonderful. So let's go ahead and start. One of the things I want to talk with people about in terms of advocating itself really does take some practice. It's not natural for a lot of us to be in an advocating position, particularly when we're talking with healthcare providers who, traditionally we've seen as being the ones who certainly have more authority and knowledge within the environment in which they're dealing, but a lot of us defer to them automatically. And so being an advocate does take some practice, and being able to have knowledge behind what you're doing and an understanding as to why you're doing it is really important. So I want to start today, and I'm going to kind of go in some sections. First of all, we're going to focus on what you can do proactively. So if you don't have a loved one right now who's in a hospital or in a nursing home and it isn't a crisis situation, we always want you to be in a proactive position as much as possible and to get yourself and your loved one ready should hospitalization or at some point nursing home level care be needed. So let's talk about being proactive first, and then we're going to go on and talk about what are some of the things to think about as an advocate while someone is actually in the hospital or while someone is in a nursing home setting. And then I'm going to talk about discharge because, again, whenever possible, discharge is really the goal for all of our loved ones if we can get them back into their own environment, if that's possible, and the things that you should think about from an advocacy standpoint there. So let's talk about the proactive part of it first. Healthcare directives and the other type of important paperwork that everyone should have in place. And so you want to make sure that, first of all, if your loved one has not gotten their healthcare directives in place, that you work with them to get those in place as soon as possible. Really important that you have in writing who they've chosen to step into their shoes to be their spokesperson, should they be unable to do that for themselves. So here in Massachusetts, of course, we use the healthcare proxy. This is a document that names an individual to step into your shoes to handle your healthcare decision making should you be in a position in which you are either incompetent or no longer capable because you are incapacitated for some reason. Remember, if the individual is capable of making their own healthcare decisions and competent to do so, then their decisions are the ones that are followed. You as the proxy are really only able to step forward for decision making if the proxy has been activated by the healthcare providers, meaning that they have determined that the person is no longer competent or capable of being able to make their own healthcare decisions in that particular instance. So the healthcare proxy is a document that we try to get in place ahead of time so that the individual is controlling who is making those important decisions for them. Another document that we also have is called the HIPAA Authorization and Release Form. HIPAA is the privacy law that went into play in the early 2000s, and this document is one in which you can name a broader group of people if you choose. So certainly you would name the proxies in that document so that they can speak with your healthcare providers, but you may choose, or your loved one may have chosen, to give a broader group of people the ability to talk with the healthcare providers so we avoid that game of telephone where one person is passing on information to others and it may get diluted or somehow changed by the time it gets to the end user. So the HIPAA form allows more people to be part of a conversation, while the healthcare proxy form is clear about who the decision maker would be. Another form that people may be aware of in Massachusetts is called the MOLST form, M-O-L-S-T. This is the Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment form. It is not done with your legal representative, with your attorney. It is done with the physician or your healthcare provider. And think about this as a prescription. This is a document that outlines more clearly what wishes are should things like extraordinary measures be needed, should things like feeding tubes be needed, being kept on a ventilator, not for treatment purposes, but for reasons to keep life going, to sustain life when possibly it's been determined that your ability to be able to recover is no longer viable. So the MOST form talks about the specifics about what the individual would or would not want to have done in a crisis. A lot of people think the proxy does that, but the truth is that the healthcare proxy does not really tell us anything about what the person would want to have done. It just gives authority to make those decisions. The MOST form actually speaks to the specifics of what someone would or would not want to have done. The other thing about the MOST form to know is that it travels with a person. So whether someone is in a home environment receiving care, in a hospital, a nursing home, a rehab, the MOST orders should follow them and should continue to be in effect unless they are somehow rescinded by the person and they've changed their mind regarding how they want those orders to read. So they're like a prescription for medication. They follow the person wherever they are. Another document that we use in Massachusetts is called a living will. A living will tends to be a statement document that talks about not wanting extraordinary measures. Now remember, this is when we're talking not about treatment. So if someone has a heart attack, or in our current environment of COVID-19, if there is a need to use a ventilator in order to treat that person's illness, that is very different than not wanting to be on a ventilator to sustain life. And so a living will, again, is a statement document that talks about not wanting those extraordinary measures to sustain life. But one thing to remember is that it is not legally binding in Massachusetts. If an individual comes to end of life and is not able to speak for themselves, we turn to a proxy. The living will is just evidence to help support a decision that the proxy may make in that situation. But it is not legally binding on the proxy or on the healthcare providers. It is only evidence to help support a decision. Another document that's really important from a legal standpoint is the durable power of attorney. Now, it doesn't affect healthcare decisions per se. It's really more of a financial decision-making document. It is a document in which a person names somebody to step into their shoes to handle their financial affairs. But finances, healthcare, handling health insurance issues, etc., can oftentimes come hand in hand. And so making sure that a power of attorney is in place as well, and that somebody has been appointed to manage those issues is really important. A couple of other things that, if you can, again, from a proactive standpoint, that you want to gather, certainly you want to get an understanding of allergies the person may have, medications, a most current medication list if you can, things like their health history, surgeries, the dates of those incidents or illnesses. All of this is really important to put together so that if your loved one is hospitalized, you've got some background to be able to share. As much as we like to think that, information about somebody is available. The truth of the matter is that we don't have a consistent way in this country of being able to share medical records. And so if your loved one goes into a facility, particularly a facility in which they are not known, there may be no information that is there about them. And even if they are known to that facility, that information may not be easily or readily available. And so as much information that you can have to be able to share is important. And certainly in the situation in which someone is under a guardianship through the courts, so this would be somebody who did not ahead of time put in place things like their healthcare proxy, and now they no longer have confidence to make decisions for themselves, and a court has had to get involved. If you are a court-appointed guardian, you do want to make sure you have that paperwork, so there's no question about your authority to be able to make decisions for that person. So let's really start talking about, again, proactively, the more you can know about your loved one and know about their wishes ahead of time, the easier it's going to be for you should you have to step into their shoes to make decisions. So when possible, you really want to have these sometimes difficult conversations with your loved ones. And by the way, you should also have these conversations with the people that you've asked to step into your shoes so that your decision makers know the framework for any decisions they may need to make, or at least have some idea of that framework. So having those conversations are important. We joke a little bit in the office here. It's the opportunity to have a cup of coffee and a piece of pie or your favorite cake with a loved one to sit down and talk about what are their healthcare concerns. How would they want things to be handled should they not be able to make those decisions for themselves? And it's everything from talking about things like end of life and what really is a vision for a good end for someone if end of life decision making needs to be done. What are their wishes around hospitalization, around nursing home level care? What is it that they would want to have done, and what is it that they say, nope, under any circumstance, I would not want to have that. And so having that conversation is really important. One of the things that we find with our clients often who come to see us after a loved one has passed away, when they haven't had the ability to have these conversations beforehand, they can really be faced with concerns about, did I make the right decision? And that guilt is something that you can really help to relieve by having this important conversation ahead of time and putting that framework for decision making in place. Another thing that we see really that gets affected by having this conversation is family unity. Whenever possible, we do want to try to maintain family unity to keep some sense of cooperation and understanding among the family members. And what we want to have is that if you're making decisions for your loved one, if you've had the ability to have that conversation with them ahead of time, and if that conversation has been shared with the larger family where appropriate, it does mean that everyone at least understands that this is what their loved one would have wanted to have done. They may not agree with it. It may not be the decision that they would make in that circumstance, but they understand that you are actually making decisions in the footsteps of the one who you're the proxy for. So more that we can work on family unity where appropriate, and the more that you can get that framework for decision making in place ahead of time, the easier it would be should you have to step into someone's shoes to make these important healthcare decisions. So now I want to switch a little bit. We talked about trying to be prepared ahead of time and the things that you can have in terms of the documents in place and the conversations with your loved ones. But now I want to get a little bit more practical. I always joke a little bit when I think about this section. My in-laws used to do a lot of traveling during their earlier retirement years, and My father-in-law always had a little plastic box that had all of his documents in it. This was before the days of being able to have things online and access them that way. But making sure that you have these things together to before you go to a hospital, or before a loved one ends up having to be put into some kind of a medical facility, the easier it would be. So certainly all of those documents that I talked about. If you have an ability, and there are many things, we happen to use a thing called DocuBank, which is an electronic form. Clients get a wallet card that has a 1-800 number on it that they can use to bring down copies of their documents. But making sure that your healthcare providers have a copy of your healthcare proxy beforehand certainly is something that you can do, along with the HIPAA form. Making sure a hospital or a specialty provider that you may use has copies of those documents ahead of time is absolutely something that can be done. Keeping hard copies with you may not be all that practical, but certainly it is something that can be done to make sure that you know where the healthcare proxy is in case it's necessary. And if you've been named as someone's healthcare proxy and you don't have a copy of the document, at the very least, make sure you know where that's kept in your loved one's home so that you can get it, and who their attorney is, so that, again, you can contact that office and get a copy of those forms if necessary. Try to get an updated list of medications. This is critical. Our medications change so frequently, and again, there is no place in which all of this information is concisely kept. And so the more up-to-date information you have regarding medications that a loved one is on is important. Making sure you understand who the emergency contacts are. So, you know, if you are a guardian for someone and you have a list of who other people are that this person wants involved in their healthcare in just their healthcare environment, make sure you know who all of those emergency contacts are, and make sure that you have any legal orders that you might need if you are actually in a guardianship situation for someone. Understanding whether they have a pacemaker, that's really important. And again, understanding their healthcare history is important. And having that in writing so that you can bring it with you to share is critical. More practical things, in today's environment, a cell phone charger. None of us wants to, end up in a hospital where, particularly today with the COVID-19, where communication is so interrupted in terms of what is normally done. Making sure your loved one has the ability to communicate, if they can, with their cell phone, with a charger, so that it doesn't end up running out of batteries. Even things like if they wear hearing aids, making sure there's extra batteries for their hearing aids. If they have glasses and they have separate pairs, know where those are, so that if something gets lost while they're in the hospital, you're able to replace those when possible. Things like personal toiletries, book or magazine. Certainly these are all things, and again, in today's environment, the hospitalizations are happening so much on a more emergency basis. I was listening to something in the news the other day that was talking about, quite frankly, hospitalizations for strokes and heart attacks are down. That doesn't mean that strokes and heart attacks themselves are down. It means that, quite frankly, people are not going to the hospital because of worries about COVID-19 to get the level of care that they may need, in which they normally would have. And so that's a little bit of a concern for all of us, that people are not seeking out emergency care in situations where they would have before all of this. But things to think about ahead of time, trying to make it so that the necessities are there and the niceties when possible for somebody. So let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about when a loved one is actually in a facility and the things that you can do to help be a more effective advocate for your loved one. And again, I want to stress that advocating is not something that's natural for most of us. And it takes practice, and you may not get it right the first time, but don't give up. Don't feel like just because you're not using the right words, you're not saying the right thing, that somehow you are not being effective. Advocating is absolutely critical when someone is in a healthcare facility or getting some kind of healthcare services. Most of us are in a compromised position when we are getting healthcare services, and particularly in this environment, the individual who is in crises is not really able to advocate for themselves. They're just not in a position in which they're able to see more of that 360-degree view of what they need. And having loved ones step in to be advocates is so critical for someone, not only in today's environment, but in an everyday environment when someone needs assistance in the healthcare community. So one of the first things, and healthcare providers that I talk to as well, one of the things I remind clients is that you're not being a burden. You're not being a pest by asking questions. There are ways to be able to do this that are respectful to the healthcare providers, that are respectful to their time and how busy they are and overwhelmed. You certainly can continue to find ways to communicate your concerns and the concerns for your loved one. So the first thing I like to remind people is that you should think of yourself as part of this healthcare team. Again, oftentimes the treating physicians, the treating healthcare providers, they may not have the full picture of your loved one. They may only be dealing with the specifics that are in front of them. So recently we had someone who had been admitted to a facility with COVID-19. The person certainly was in distress and needed emergency services, but the part that was not really understood by the healthcare providers at the time, this person had a severe hearing deficit. So that was something that was not by any means visible to the healthcare team as they began to deal with this person. And they also were dealing with the beginning stages of dementia. And so they were also having, some struggles around other things, forgetting certain aspects of where they were and weren't able to communicate in the same way that they could had they not been dealing with the dementia. So as the patient's advocate, the family members needed to make sure that the healthcare team understood, at the very least, some of the issues that were in addition to the COVID-19 issues that this person was dealing with. And that's where that communication was so important. And so one of the things you first want to do is find out who are the members of your healthcare, of your loved one's healthcare team. Do what you can to get names. Who's responsible for what? Who's their primary nurses in some of the different shifts? Who are the primary physicians who are dealing with them, and some of the specialty providers who may be dealing with them? Get as many names and identification as you can so that you know who you're talking with and what role they play within this team. You want to understand who's working with your loved one. And again, remember, particularly in a healthcare environment like a hospital or a nursing home, there are different shifts. And so you have to understand who the players are on all of the different shifts. There may be somebody within the healthcare team who is identified as the primary contact. And one of the things you want to provide the healthcare team is a primary contact for the family. Who really is the spokesman for the family? And usually that's the healthcare proxy. This is the person who's going to bring concerns that the family has forward. And you want to have this conversation with your family so that you don't have 10 people hitting the healthcare providers all at once with questions and concerns. It's easier for them if they have a point person who they're able to share information with. Now, that doesn't mean that other family members can't communicate and can't by any means, contact their loved one and try to participate, but understand that the more people who are involved, the more difficult it is for the healthcare team to parse out who it is they should be sharing information with. And you can, again, end up with that game of telephone in which one person got this piece of information and another person got that piece, and they never came together. So it's important to have a point person for the family as well as to who's going to be talking about particularly major concerns and disseminating that information to others in the family. There are some great resources out there, and if anyone received, or you should have all received the booklet about, 10 things to consider when a loved one is hospitalized, there are some great things out there from a technology standpoint to help to share. There's a thing called Caring Village, in which you can actually set up a secure page and share with people who you've invited in to give an update as to what's happening with your family member. So everyone, again, is kept as current as possible. So understand who the players are, understand what their different roles are within the team, and understand what's the best way to communicate with them. And ask this, if you're not sure, talk with them, find out when's good time to communicate, who should you communicate, and what's the best way to communicate. Would that be by telephone? Would that be by email these days? Again, what's the best way to help keep information flowing between yourself and the team members, and remind yourself that you are part of this team as you go forward.
Kathleen, we have a question.
Absolutely.
If a family member has a healthcare proxy and a power of attorney in place, is it necessary to have a MOLST when they enter into a hospital or long-term care facility?
So a MOLST is never a have to. It is more of a specific way to deal with particularly end-of-life decision-making. So a MOLST is an interesting thing. Some physicians, some healthcare providers will not sign a MOLST with someone unless they are more at an end-of-life situation or have a disease process in which these end-of-life decisions appear to be more possible than not. And so the MOLST is the least important of all of them. However, it can provide very good and clear direction about what someone does or doesn't want to have done in an emergent or quite frankly, end-of-life situation.
All right, that was it.
All right, terrific.
Oh, I'm sorry, hold on.
Oh, yeah.
He also asked, may they complete one when they are in the hospital or long-term care facility?
As long as an individual is competent to be able to make healthcare decisions, then yes. They can sign a healthcare proxy if they don't have one in place already once they enter a facility, and they can participate in with their healthcare provider in creating a MOLST. But it's really going to depend on the person and whether they are competent to be able to make those kinds of decisions for themselves. And that competency is determined by the healthcare providers at the time. One thing I want to remind people, if someone has a healthcare proxy in place and it does reflect their choice as to who their decision making will be, you don't want them to sign a new healthcare proxy just because they're entering a facility. Use the one that is currently in place so that there is, first of all, no confusion about which proxy is taking precedent. And usually when you have a proxy done with an attorney as opposed to the one-page proxy that is done with most healthcare facilities, it's a more robust document and it gives a broader breadth of authority to the proxy. So you want to keep that one in place when you can, and don't just have yourself or a loved one sign a new proxy just because you're entering a facility. The one you had in place prior should carry, and that's why you need to keep a copy or know where it is in order to be able to present it when needed.
Very good, thank you.
Excellent. So let's now talk about being prepared to speak up. And again, this can be the most difficult part of advocating. Oftentimes, again, the healthcare community, particularly at this time, is overwhelmed. They've got lots going on, whether they're in the hospital or in a nursing home facility. This is an incredibly difficult environment for everyone. And learning how to speak up effectively and when to speak up is really important here. So number one, again, make sure that you know who you are communicating with. Who are the people who are caring for your loved one? What's the preferable way, if you can, to communicate with people so that you can get answers that you need, and what's the best way to make sure that you're being kept up to speed with what's happening. You know, prior to all of this, we could go in, we could ask for family meetings, we could ask to speak with the providers directly, face to face. In most situations at this point, we're not able to go into the facility when a loved one is hospitalized. We're not able to go into the nursing home facility to be able to see our loved ones. So we have to find other ways to be able to speak with the people who are providing the care for our loved ones and dealing with what our concerns are. Technology, I've seen more and more of the organizations now utilizing technology, bringing in things like these Zoom conferences to be able to do FaceTime with people. Again, if your loved one has a cell phone, and being able to use the technology that might be on their smartphones these days, you want to be able to utilize all of that as well as you can. And you may need to practice a little bit even with that technology ahead of time. You know, we found with all of this and now having to do Zoom conferences, we had to jump in with both feet. This isn't a typical way that we provide information, but it's one that's now become critical in the current environment, and one that I do believe is going to continue to be critical as we move forward. But as you're learning to who you're going to be speaking with, a couple of things to think about in terms of what to talk with the healthcare providers about. Always make sure that you understand what's the treatment plan, what's the goals for your loved one in the hospital, what's happening now, why are they doing certain tests. All of these questions are reasonable for you to ask and to understand what's happening. Why are they asking for this test to be done, or maybe not that test to be done? Why are they going down this treatment protocol as opposed to another treatment protocol? All of that is very, very reasonable for you to have those conversations, and reasonable for you to understand on behalf of your loved one. One of the things I do want to caution people about, although I'm guilty of it as well, which is turning to Dr. Google when something happens. Do remember that the internet can be an incredible place to find really great information, but not all of the information that is on the internet is accurate. Not all of it is up to date. Sometimes you can pull up information that is no longer current. And there can be, you know, what is good for one patient, one person, is not necessarily good for another. And this is why understanding why certain tests are being run or not run, and why certain treatment plans are being recommended and others are not, is important to have those conversations with the providers about specifically. Another thing is, remember, this world, this medical world, is a world unto itself with its own language. And a lot of people don't necessarily understand all the terms in this world. And so don't be afraid to ask for a, quite frankly, commonplace explanation for something so that you can understand what's happening. You know, physicians, nurses, healthcare providers tend to use medical definitions for things, and a lot of us need those medical definitions translated so that we can understand in real terms what's happening. So don't be afraid at all to ask for clarification regarding what they're talking about, and making sure that you understand what they're discussing. Another thing is that communication should happen on a timely basis with you. Now, that doesn't mean immediate for all situations. You do need to be reasonable when you're approaching any of this, but you do have a right to communication continually about your loved one. And if you have a question, you have a right to a reasonable time frame for an answer on that question or concern. So communication is something that you have a right to expect. One of the things that we included in the documentation for you are patients' rights. And take a look at those, because residents in nursing home facilities, patients in hospital facilities, all have very specific rights. And rights to communication, rights for information to be shared, rights for communicating with their loved ones, all of these things, even in this environment, continue to be the rights of the individuals who are being provided the care. And you as their advocate, have a right to speak up about that if you're concerned at all about what's happening. The other thing is, a lot of times we automatically assume that the healthcare providers are right. Now, again, most of us are dealing with very, very seasoned, very capable people who do know exactly what they're doing, and they truly do want what's best for our loved ones in these situations. But they may not have all the information. Again, if you haven't been able to share the history about somebody, about what's happening, they may be making some presumptions that the individual does have dementia when the truth is they're hard of hearing, or that English is a second language for them, or they truly don't have a good grasp of what's happening and are not understanding, and so they're not presenting themselves in a way in which they may be, in which it may be viewed that they are having beginning signs of dementia. And so, or they may have dementia, and thus they're not able to really understand what's happening. So putting things in context, not presuming that the providers know what they're doing. If you have concerns about something, speak up. Speak for your loved one. Make sure that your concerns are heard. And so don't always presume that the healthcare providers know best. You may have a context that they don't have regarding how to communicate or provide services to your loved one. And another thing to remember about these kind of advocacy positions that you're going to be taking is that they can be done in a respectful way. They can be done in a way in which you can be, again, an advocate. You can be assertive without being abrasive. And that's, again, where it comes with some practice, because all of us, as we're dealing with these very complex and, quite frankly, very stressful situations, it can be hard to remember that. But taking a deep breath, getting your information together, making sure you know who it is you want to be speaking with, and asking the questions. You have a right to be able to have your questions and concerns heard and to advocate for your loved one. Are there any questions about that? Because that can be a really tough part in terms of actually being the one who's the spokesperson for your loved one.
So far, there have not been any other questions.
Okay, perfect.
I'll let you know if there are.
Thank you. So, tip number 3. Any of us, when we go into a medical appointment, and we talk about this, whether we're dealing with COVID-19 issues or we're talking about people in what was the good old days of being able to get services. Some things to think about before you approach any situation. Number 1, if you can, write down your issues and concerns. Make sure that you have bullet points for yourself so that when you're talking with the healthcare providers who may have limited time to be able to have a conversation with you, that you're clear about what your concerns are, what the issues are, and you don't end up being in a situation in which you had 10 things that you wanted to say, but you forgot 7 of them because you were flustered, or the circumstances around you made it so that you couldn't remember what you really wanted to communicate. So make sure you write down as many of the questions and concerns that you have ahead of time, and use what time you have with the healthcare providers as productively as possible. If you're using things like telehealth these days, which more and more of the providers are turning to, try to get yourself familiar with that technology ahead of time. Again, just like this Zoom technology, if you can do a little practicing, making sure that you get onto the system and you're able to actually access it, those are things that you want to try to get done ahead of time so that it's one less thing that's causing commotion and concern at the time. Again, oftentimes the healthcare providers only have limited time to be able to be there to hear what your concerns and questions are, so you want to use it all as effectively as possible. And also, make sure you're taking time to really listen to what the explanation is that's being provided to you. If there are words that are being used, medical terminology, etc., that you don't understand, ask for clarification. There's absolutely, again, nothing wrong with saying, could you say that again for me? I don't understand. Could you say that in, in a little bit of a simpler language for me so that I can really understand what it is you're talking about? Go slow. Make sure that you're digesting everything that's being said. Usually as the advocate, you're the one who's the eyes and ears for your loved one in terms of trying to disseminate the information that's being provided. It's interesting, I think there are some data out there that says when we go to see our physicians, particularly our healthcare providers, particularly when we're under stress, we're only understanding something like 34 or 35% of what is actually being provided the first time through. And so that's really important that we can miss a lot of the information that's being provided. If you don't understand it, ask them to say it again. Ask if there's a way that you can even, send, let's say, an email afterward that said, this is my understanding of what happened. Or you're at least able to have a follow-up conversation with them if you need more clarification to make sure that your understanding of what was said is actually what they said. So take time, write down your questions when you can ahead of time, get yourself familiar with the technology, if any is being used, so that that doesn't become a barrier to all of this, and take it slow. Make sure you understand what's being said and ask for clarification when you need it. So back to the issue of advocating, reminding yourself that this is oftentimes a new role for each one of us if we are advocating for a loved one. Some tips to think about. First of all, remember that you're a member of the team. And so as a team member, you certainly have a right to information. You have a right to share your concerns, but as a team member as well, you want to take some time to understand what's being shared with you, how it's being shared with you, and being able to ask for that clarification when you need it. Remember, you have a right and your loved one has a patient's bill of right, both in the hospital setting, a nursing home facility setting, rehab, wherever they are, there is a bill of rights. And you have a right to a copy of that if you'd like. We did provide you with some information, and also mass.gov does also have posted information regarding patients' bills of right. You have a right to respectfully disagree with decisions that may be being made, with whatever may be happening with your loved one. It's being respectful when you can. That means that you do want to do it in a way which is constructive for your loved one, not destructive to the situation. But don't be afraid to disagree if you have good reason to do so. And you may need to bounce that off of somebody. You may need to say, am I thinking about this correct? Am I approaching this well? There are, quite frankly, good people out there. There's attorneys, there are patient advocates you can turn to if you need the help of a professional. But even other family members, friends, to be able to bounce off, am I viewing this correctly in terms of a disagreement you may have in a situation? You always have the right to choose the community in which your loved one is going to be transferred. So do remember that. Now, there may be some limitations. For instance, there may be certain requirements regarding their medical condition that have to be met. There may be, unfortunately, no open beds in a particular facility that you may want to go to. There may be issues around insurance and payment for the facility, but you do have a right to have a choice of facilities for your loved one when they're transferring from one level of care to another. And oftentimes I recommend to people, if possible, get to know what community resources are out there. Get to know the different facilities in our community here so that you have an idea of what would be acceptable to you and your loved one should hospitalization be required and some kind of a transfer to rehab or skilled nursing facility afterward. Knowing before the emergency happens, before you are right in the middle of the crises, can really help you make a much more clear-minded decision about a next step. Make sure that you communicate with the staff, again, not only about their health care, about their past health care, and the specifics about this person, hard of hearing, they wear glasses. There's nothing worse for me than when I go in to see somebody in a healthcare facility and I am looking at them and they're having trouble either hearing me because their hearing aids aren't in or seeing me because their glasses aren't on. It's really important that those small little things be communicated because it makes an enormous difference. I, for one, could never go anywhere without my glasses. But there are other things too that should be shared. If there are important things like religious beliefs that should be known by the staff and make sure that they're honored. These kinds of individual preferences, you do want to share about your loved one with the staff so they're better able to meet their needs and be able to meet them 100% as a full person, not just the specific aspects of their medical needs at the time.
Kathleen.
Yes.
So David Coughlin from Life Care Center of Acton is on with us.
Hi, Dave.
And he wanted to make sure that we mention that it's important for families to know that in advance of their loved one entering into a skilled nursing facility, that in communicating with the nursing team, that when you check on your loved one, the facility is only responsible to provide information about the patient to the healthcare proxy and not other family members.
So this is where I think it's important to go back to trying to have a point person, the person who would be communicating. And again, usually that is the healthcare proxy unless the patient has given explicit permission to be able to share information with others. But that really does help the healthcare facility as well when they know who the point person is and who has been given permission to be able to share that information. And it does make it so that the communication is easier on both ends. So thank you, David. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Kathy.
So a little bit about advocating during this particular time. And it truly is an unprecedented time in so many different ways. As you all know, between the amount of increased stress that we're all feeling and certainly the stress that our healthcare system is currently dealing with. The inability for us to be able to go into the facilities. This has become extremely difficult for so many people, not only by all means for the patient who is now left without the family support that they may otherwise have wanted or been used to, but for the family members who are not able to get in and see. So do be aware that in most facilities at this point, most communities like nursing home facilities, assisted living facilities, and certainly the hospitals, there are very strict guidelines in place right now regarding the visitation of family and friends. But there are other ways to be able to visit. First of all, I do want to let you know there is an exception, and it is the compassionate situation exception. And this is usually for end-of-life situations for an individual in which the facility may be able to make exceptions to be able to get family members, and again, it's usually a very limited number, to be able to come in at end of life for their loved one. But there are other ways of being able to communicate when possible with your loved one. Use of technology, again, getting used to using things like FaceTime, asking the facility, do they have iPads to be able to do that? Do they have other forms of technology in order to be able to let you put at least a voice with the person and hopefully eyes on the person? A lot of facilities that we work with have been putting this in place for their community so that loved ones can communicate with the resident when they need to or want to.
Kathleen, Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
But again, David Coughlin from Life Care Center of Acton has mentioned that they have set up their entire facility with tablets. So every short-term rehab patient and long-term care patient can communicate face-to-face for 30 minutes with their family.
That's fantastic.
And so, yeah, so they have that, they just sign up for a 30-minute spot and they can communicate with their loved ones that way.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. I have also seen in the situations in which there is, these compassionate situations in which there is the ability to go in. One thing to remember is that the facility will most likely have very strict protocols around that. Things like the use of personal protective equipment, wearing a mask, potentially wearing gowns and gloves, and restricting your movement when you're in the facility. All those things are critical these days, and each facility will have their own requirements around that based on the CDC requirements. So wonderful.
Thank you.
So last but not least, planning for discharge and beyond, because again, our hope is that your loved one will recoup from what's happened, whether it be dealing with the COVID-19 or another healthcare situation. And some of the things to think about when, in terms of advocating when a loved one is being discharged. Make sure you know who the social worker case manager is, who was assigned at the facility to help to arrange for that discharge. Again, identify who they are and have a chance to speak with them. Make sure that you understand clearly what the treatment plan is when discharge occurs. Are they going to be getting services at home? What will those services look like? Who will be providing those services? How frequent are those services going to be provided? You really want to have a good understanding of all of that to make sure that that transfer, that handoff from the facility setting to the home setting is as smooth as possible, and that the services that were ordered while in the facility get translated to the home setting. This includes, again, not only treatments that they may be receiving, the amount of care that they're expecting to receive, and a full understanding of any medications that they may be getting when they come home. I can't tell you how many times, we see that the medication changes from when the person was home originally, now in a facility, and then going home again, their whole medication regimen may change. And so make sure that you have a clear understanding of that. You should know the types of medications that the person's getting, the purpose for those medications, the side effects of that medication, so that you can, again, have a clear understanding of that treatment protocol. If they're going to need specialized care, rehab services, home care, physical therapy, speech therapy, nursing services, you want to know what's been ordered at the hospital and who's going to be providing that care at home, how frequently, and by what provider. Again, you have a choice in terms of the providers that are used, but you want to make sure you understand who they are and what's been ordered ahead of time. And you also want to know when's the next follow-up. What's the next steps? When are they supposed to follow up with their healthcare professionals after their discharge? So get a good plan in place for discharge, understand who the players are going to be then as well, and what that treatment plan looks like. So that's it. Questions for people?
There haven't been any questions that have come in. Let's give people a second if they want to type something in. But while we wait for those, I just want to remind everybody that you can go to our website for more resources, such as some videos and ebooks. And we do want to do more seminars like this. So if you have any suggestions for topics that are of interest to you, please just feel free to contact me. You have my email, and our phone number is 978-263-0006. And of course, as always, if you do have further questions that are a little more personal regarding you or your loved one's legal needs, you can always call or email us to set up a time to talk with Kathleen or any of our attorneys. Oh, I have a little pop-up. Oh, somebody just says thank you. So it looks like we are all set, Kathleen.
Wonderful. I hope this was helpful for everybody. Keep yourselves well out there, and let us know if there's any other questions or concerns that come up. Thank you so much for
Very good.
participating today.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.